Welcome to section 5.1, where we're going to focus on this idea of diversity. So we're going to discuss what it means, what it is, as well as why we should care about it. So there's three basic ways we can approach this idea of diversity. The first will be biodiversity, and we'll talk about that. That's primarily going to be like the number of species. Then genetic diversity, which is going to be essentially the diversity of genes that are within a species. And then lastly, which I'm going to cover entirely here, is this idea of ecosystem diversity. Now, ecosystem diversity is going to be a diversity that is, let's look at an area, let's say a country, and we want to understand how many different types of ecosystems there are. Because diversity normally means, differences. So if you have a country that's entirely desert, that's going to be pretty low ecosystem diversity. If you have a country that's solely rainforest, still going to be relatively low ecosystem diversity because it's all the same type of ecosystem. But ideally, if you're looking at a country that has, dozens of different types of ecosystems, where you have different types of forests, different types of grassland, you've got, deserts, maybe even tundra or something more cold thrown in there. But if we get an area that has lots of different types of ecosystems, this gives us much more diversity. It allows for us to sustain many more different types of species because we have so many different types of environments that are there. It's not so uniform. Now with biodiversity, the simplest way to look at biodiversity is to just say it's purely the number of species in an area. To go out there and count, and you'll see that something like the tropical rainforest is going to have a high number of species, whereas something like the desert is going to have a relatively low number of species. So that's one way you can treat it. That's the simplest way. But scientists also like to put a little bit more nuance into this. They like to know a little bit more information. And so one of the things that they'll do is use this concept of species diversity, which is very similar to just straight up biodiversity, straight up number of species. We just want one extra piece of information. And that extra piece of information is the relative abundance. So let's say you have species 1 through 9. Right? There's going to be a lot more species in this in reality, but we're just going to keep it simple so I can squeeze everything in here. So if we have these 9 species, that would be my biodiversity. Sometimes they call it species richness, but that would be essentially the information that I would have if we were just going by the regular definition as far as number of species. But that doesn't tell me how many of each of these guys there are. And so when we talk about species diversity, it accounts for the fact of how many of each there are. So we might end up looking at this and realizing that if you analyze the number of each of these species, you might find out that 90% of the organisms that are living there are the type of species 1. Whereas you might only have, roughly 1% or 2% of each of the others. So if I go through and analyze this now, I would see that this ecosystem that appeared to be very diverse as I initially was looking at it, this ecosystem that might have had a lot of species actually isn't very diverse because almost all the living organisms that are there are one type of species. The other types of species have such low numbers that there's a decent chance that they could go extinct. It's just not as stable. And so this idea of species diversity accounts for that, so it gives us a better sense of just how stably diverse an environment is. Not just how many species there are, but essentially the relative abundance of each, how much of the total number of organisms are each type of species. In a really stable ecosystem, we'd like this to be more close together. So you might see that, 10% are this type, 5 are this, maybe 15 are this type, 5 here, 3 here. They'll fluctuate, but you shouldn't see a whole bunch of the species have only a relatively small number of organisms that are living there. That doesn't imply as much stability. Now the other type of diversity that we have, the last type for now, is genetic diversity. Now this is critical because while it doesn't give us more species, at least not initially, the key bit of this is that it allows us to realize how able that species is to adapt, how able that species will be to evolve, how likely it is to persist over time. Because the more genes that you possess, that's this idea here, gene diversity is the options you have when it comes to genes. The different versions of the genes that you have that can give you the Great Dane here, or give you the, I don't know which version of a little yappy dog it is, but some version of a yappy dog, you have both those genes are kind of within the species that we have that's domesticated dogs. And so it's critical that we can kind of understand how diverse a species is, so that way if changes occur to their ecosystem, if changes occur, period, whether it's a disaster, something else happens, new species, we want to know, are they likely to have some ammunition? Are they likely to have some tools in their toolbox genetically that they can use to adapt to it rapidly? If they don't have a lot of genetic diversity, they don't have many options to change with the changing environment, and that can lead to extinction. So genetic diversity is a huge thing when we're talking about this idea of adaptability, of persistence of a species throughout time. Now, the last thing that we want to really discuss in 5.1 is, why do we care? You know, we talk a lot about preserving nature, preserving biodiversity, keeping these species alive, keeping their genetic diversity good so they can stay alive longer, maintaining the ecosystems that we have so that we can experience the different ecosystems and we can experience the different organisms that live in those ecosystems. So we've got all that down. But why? And there is a pragmatic, a practical reason for keeping this, because the environment does a lot of stuff for us, a lot of things that make us healthier and a lot of things that save us money. So even if you dislike animals and plants for some reason, or you don't like nature, you have to at some point understand that if you damage nature, you are still harming yourself. You know, when we want to go through and get food, to get crops, especially as our population keeps growing, we need agriculture. And agriculture, as we have these additional species of plant and animal, can use those species of plant and animal for food. Or in some cases, we can even pluck out some genes that they possess that are really good genes, and we can insert those in the livestock that we have, in the crops that we have, to give them those unique traits that can let us grow more food, better food, and help us stay alive. So if we go through and damage species, if we damage the genetics of those species, we can be harming ourselves in the long run because we no longer have access to those. So that's one reason to kind of keep these organisms around and keep their genes around. The other idea is many of our medicines are derived from plants and in some cases animals, things like snake venom. So if we start getting rid of a lot of these species, we no longer can look at the particular molecules that they possess that have allowed them to survive to now. And so if we can use those things to help us survive, to kill our bacterial infections, to, damage viruses or prevent them from causing us harm, to reduce fevers or help our blood clot or help our blood thin, there's all kinds of medicines that are out there, and so many of them have come from plants and animals, it gets to be dangerous if you just kind of wipe them all out. We don't know what potential, super drug or cure could be out there that we just destroyed. And then services. When you have nature, so for instance, this is a watershed that's in New York. So when you look at a lot of these watersheds where water drains, percolates through the soil, into the groundwater, you're getting a lot of services done for us. Namely, it's filtering the water for us. There's a reason so much of the water that we drink, we get from groundwater. We get from, these deep wells. Because as the water kind of percolates, as it kind of goes through the ground, it starts to get filtered, it starts to react with things, so it pulls out a lot of the toxins, it pulls out a lot of the organisms, and so by the time it makes its way down into these deep underground lakes, if you will, these aquifers, the groundwater, by the time it reaches there, in most cases it's been rendered drinkable. So it might not be safe just to go up to a pond and scoop some up and start drinking it, but if you've got that well, that water is usually drinkable. So this is doing a huge service for us to help make sure that we have usable, safe water, and we didn't pay a cent to have that happen. Nature just did that for us. It also helps control water, where if you've got things like flooding, whether it's from rains, whether it's from hurricanes, a lot of these wetlands, a lot of these watersheds can ultimately funnel that water safely to a location away from us. Or if the water does start to rise, the wetlands basically fill up instead of our backyards, instead of our basements. And so these guys can help control things like flooding. And once again, we don't have to pay money to build walls or things like that. If we leave the watershed in place, if we leave the wetlands in place, they'll normally take care of that for us for free. We just have to not destroy them, And then lastly, and this one you can think is superficial, but a lot of the stuff's pretty. I mean, there's something to be said that I want my kids to see a tiger. I want my kids to see, a koala bear, a panda bear. I want them to know that these guys are out there. Now, the sad thing is it makes it more difficult for us to keep things alive that are kind of ugly. So we'll look in class and see things like the ii that a lot of people think looks like a train wreck, and so it might make them more willing to get rid of it. But in general, there's something to be said for having these wonderful things to look at, whether it's because they're so amazingly pretty, or in some cases you could even argue because they're so amazingly ugly. It'd be nice to be able to say, hey, check this thing out. It still exists. It's still something that I can look at, that I can show people, and I can preserve.